Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we step into a ballroom glittering with champagne, diamonds, and secrets. The kind of night where everyone smiles for the cameras, and no one notices the knife behind the smile. A celebrated socialite stands at the podium, microphone in hand, about to do something reckless, something brave. She is going to name names. Corruption, greed, betrayal, all of it, laid bare in front of hundreds of guests, a live orchestra, and a room full of flashing cameras. She never finishes her speech. Within moments, she is dead, poisoned in front of everyone, and yet, somehow, no one saw a thing. Enter Hercule Poirot, older now, a little slower than he once was, but his mind, his mind has lost none of its hunger for the truth. He will tell you something curious. The most crowded room is often the easiest place to commit a murder, because everyone is watching the wrong thing. So settle in, pour yourself something, perhaps not champagne, and let us begin. The speech. The Grosvenor Hall had never looked lovelier than it did that November evening in 1953. Chandeliers dripped their light over 300 guests in black tie and diamonds, and beneath them moved the particular currency of London society: laughter that meant nothing, glances that meant everything, and the low murmur of people pretending not to watch each other. The Marchbanks Charitable Trust had spared no expense for its annual gala, and why should it, when the guest list alone read like a page torn from Debrett's? At the center of it all, as she always contrived to be, stood Vivian Ashcombe. She was not, strictly speaking, the most beautiful woman in the room. Lady Pemberton's niece had a better claim to that. But Vivian had something rarer. She had the gift of being watched. When she laughed, heads turned toward the sound before they even knew what they were listening for. When she crossed a room, conversations paused mid-sentence, resuming a beat too late, as though everyone needed a moment to recover. She wore emerald green that night, a color that did nothing to soften her and everything to sharpen her, and she moved through the crowd with the ease of a woman who had long ago stopped being nervous about being looked at. "You're staring," murmured a voice near his elbow, and Hercule Poirot turned to find his old friend Inspector Japp, retired now, thickened round the middle, but with the same knowing eyes, regarding him with amusement. "I am observing," Poirot corrected, smoothing one side of his moustache. "There is a difference, mon ami, though I confess the English rarely trouble themselves to learn it." Observing what exactly? Poirot did not answer at once. In truth, he was not entirely certain himself, only that something about the evening pricked at him the way a loose thread pricks at a well-made coat. It was, perhaps, nothing more than fatigue. He had crossed from Ostend only 2 days prior, and his knees had not forgiven him for the crossing. Or perhaps it was simply that rooms such as this one, glittering, loud, watched by 100 eyes, and yet somehow deeply private, had always made him uneasy. A murder, he had once told a young detective in Yorkshire, does not require darkness. It requires only distraction. "I am observing," he said finally, "that Madame Ashcombe knows something no one else in this room knows, and that she is enjoying it enormously." Japp snorted. "That's just Vivian. Woman's always been like that. Runs that little society paper of hers, the one that prints things people would rather stayed unprinted." "Ah, the Mayfair correspondent. That's the one. Ruined old Etheridge's marriage 2 years back. Practically drove young Farnsworth out of the country." Japp shook his head, not without a certain admiration. "She's dangerous, that one. Pretty as anything, and dangerous as a wasp in a jam jar." Poirot said nothing, but he watched Vivian Ashcombe a moment longer as she paused beside a heavy-set man with a florid face and a wineglass gripped rather too tightly. Bertram Voss, the property developer, whose name Poirot recalled from that morning's newspaper, in connection with a housing scheme in the East End that had collapsed rather spectacularly, along with the savings of several hundred families. Vivian said something to him, quite low, and smiled. Voss did not smile back. His knuckles, Poirot noted, had gone white around the stem of his glass. Interesting. At 9:30, the orchestra fell silent, and Sir Reginald Marchbanks, small, pink, perpetually apologetic in manner, took the small stage to thank everyone for their generosity, to remind them of the orphanage in Kent that their donations would support, and to introduce, with evident pride, the evening's guest speaker. "Some of you," Sir Reginald said, beaming, "will know Miss Ashcombe as a woman who is never afraid to say what others would rather leave unsaid. Tonight, I understand, will be no exception." There was laughter at this, polite, uncertain laughter, the kind that does not know yet whether it ought to be laughing. And then Vivian Ashcombe climbed the 3 small steps to the podium, and the room quieted, the way a room quiets when it senses, correctly, that something is about to happen. She did not begin with thanks, or with pleasantries about the orphanage, or with any of the soft nothings such speeches usually required. She began, instead, by saying, "I had intended tonight to speak about generosity. Instead, I find I would rather speak about its opposite." The silence sharpened. "There are people in this room," she continued, and her eyes moved, unhurried across the crowd, "who have built their fortunes on the backs of people who will never see the inside of a room like this one. Men who have taken money meant for the poor and quietly rerouted it into their own pockets. I have spent the better part of a year gathering the proof of it. Names, dates, bank transfers that were never meant to be found. A glass shattered somewhere near the back of the hall. An accident, surely, though several heads turned toward the sound with a violence of relief, glad of anywhere else to look. I had planned," Vivian went on, "to name every one of them tonight, but I find I am feeling, for once, almost merciful. So I will say only this." And here she smiled, the particular smile Poirot had already come to recognize as belonging to a woman who knew precisely the value of the silence she was creating. "You know who you are. And by Monday morning, so will everyone else." The applause that followed was not, Poirot thought, wholly enthusiastic. It came in a ragged wave, uncertain of itself, swelling only as the more socially adept guests recognized the necessity of clapping for something they did not entirely understand and did not particularly wish to. Someone near the front rose to their feet, and others followed out of obligation more than admiration, until the whole room stood clapping into the bright chandelier light, and the small orchestra, taking its cue, struck up something bright and forgettable to smooth over the moment's edges. It was, Poirot reflected afterward, turning the scene over and over in his mind, the way a jeweler turns a stone, searching for the flaw he knows must be there. A moment of perfect and total distraction. 300 people on their feet, waiters moving through the crowd with fresh trays of champagne, weaving between elbows and evening gowns. The orchestra loud enough to cover any small sound, and at the center of it, Vivian Ashcombe, flushed with her own triumph, reaching for the glass a waiter offered her, dark-haired, quick-moving, gone before anyone thought to remember his face, and lifting it to her lips as the applause reached its peak. Poirot, from where he stood near the edge of the hall, could not have said afterward whether he saw the moment the glass changed, or whether he only imagined, later, that he had. That was the trouble with it. That was, he would come to understand, the entire genius of it. He saw only what everyone else saw, a beautiful woman, glowing with the particular light of having just done something dangerous and true, drinking to her own courage. Within 11 minutes, Vivian Ashcombe was dead. The applause has ended. The screaming began near the terrace doors. Poirot heard it before he understood it. A single voice, high and disbelieving, cutting through the orchestra's determinedly cheerful waltz. And then a second voice, and a third, and the music faltered and stopped in the graceless way music stops, when the musicians themselves have turned to look. He was not, in truth, a young man any longer, and he did not run, but he moved with more urgency than his knees entirely approved of, threading between guests who had gone still and pale, toward the little alcove near the terrace, where Vivian Ashcombe lay on the marble floor. Her emerald skirts pooled around her like something spilled. She was dead. Poirot had seen enough of death to know it at a glance, though a young man in spectacles, a doctor evidently, dragged from among the guests, was kneeling beside her all the same, pressing 2 fingers to her throat with the particular helplessness of a man performing a ritual he already knows is useless. "Poison," the doctor said when he looked up. His name, Poirot would learn shortly, was Dr. Hugh Latimer, and he had the unhappy distinction of being the only medical man present at a society murder. I'd stake my license on it. The lips, do you see the color? And there, the fingernails. I'd guess a cyanide compound, though I couldn't tell you which without the glass, Poirot finished. Yes, without the glass. They both looked, then for the glass, and it was in that looking that Poirot felt the first cold understanding of what he was dealing with, for there was no glass beside the body. There were, in fact, glasses everywhere, abandoned on side tables, forgotten in the hands of guests, too shocked to remember they were holding them. Several dozen identical crystal flutes scattered across a ballroom of 300 people, every one of them, to the casual eye, exactly alike. "Nobody," Poirot murmured. "Touch anything if you please, until the police arrive. Sir Reginald," he caught the small pink man, who had gone the color of old wax, "if you would be so good as to have the doors closed. Gently. There is no need for panic, only for patience." There was, of course, panic. A ballroom does not stay orderly simply because a Belgian gentleman with an excellent moustache requests it. But there was, eventually, also patience of a sort. Once Sir Reginald's staff had shepherded the guests into the adjoining drawing room, and the police had been summoned, and the small orchestra had packed away their instruments with the particular guilty haste of men who wish very much to be elsewhere, Detective Inspector Colin Reeve arrived within the half-hour, a lean, sharp-faced young man whom Poirot did not know, and who regarded Poirot's presence at the scene with the polite suspicion younger policemen so often reserved for elderly foreign gentlemen who seemed to know rather more than they ought. "You were a guest here tonight, Mr. Poirot." "An old friend of Inspector Japp's, who is also present, if you wish to confirm my credentials," Poirot said. "I am, I confess, rather more than a guest by habit, though I assure you, I did not arrange to attend a murder this evening. I had hoped, in fact, for a quiet dinner and an early night." Reeve's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Well, since you're here, anything strike you?" Poirot considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, walking a slow half-circle around the place where the body had lain, now marked only by a faint darkness on the marble, where something, champagne perhaps, or something else, had spilled and not yet been cleaned away. "Several things," he said. "First, she died within, I would estimate, 10 minutes of drinking. That suggests a fast-acting agent, and a substantial dose. Second, the glass is missing, which suggests either that someone removed it deliberately, or that it was cleared away by one of the waiters in the general confusion, not knowing its significance. Third, and here he paused, frowning slightly, for this was the part that troubled him most, she was given that glass during the loudest, most crowded moment of the entire evening, the applause following her speech. 300 people rising to their feet at once. Inspector. A waiter moving through a forest of arms and elbows. If a man wished to hand a woman a glass containing poison, and wished never to be remembered doing it, he could not have designed a better moment. You think it was planned, the timing? I think, Poirot said slowly, that it is either a very great coincidence or a very great cleverness. And I have lived a long time, Inspector, without yet meeting a coincidence quite so obliging. Reeve made a note, then glanced up. The husband's here, insisting on seeing the body. Want to sit in? Gerald Ashcombe was a tall, sandy-haired man of perhaps 45, with the sort of handsome, weathered face that photographed well and revealed almost nothing, and when he was brought into the small anteroom where Poirot and Reeve waited, his hands were shaking, though whether from grief, Poirot could not yet say, for shaking hands, he had learned long ago, could mean 100 different things, and grief was only one of them. "I want to see her," Ashcombe said, before either man had spoken. "In a moment, Mr. Ashcombe. First, if you would answer a few questions." "Questions?" Ashcombe laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My wife is dead, and you want questions." "I want," Reeves said, not unkindly, "to find whoever did this. Questions are how that happens." Ashcombe sat, heavily, and passed a hand over his face. "Ask then. When did you last see your wife alive?" "During her speech. I was near the bar, at the back. I didn't go up to congratulate her afterward, if that's what you're asking. He stopped. "You'd what, Mr. Ashcombe?" "We'd argued, before the gala, about the speech, if you must know. I asked her not to give it. Not the way she meant to give it." His jaw tightened. "She had a habit of making enemies, Inspector, in the pursuit of what she called the truth. I told her one of them would do something about it one day. She laughed at me." Poirot, who had been silent, leaned forward slightly. "Monsieur, forgive me. You say you did not go to congratulate her. Did anyone see you at the bar during the applause?" Something flickered across Ashcombe's face. Quick, gone before it could properly be named. "I don't know. It was crowded. Everyone was standing, clapping. I don't imagine anyone was paying much attention to me at all." "No," Poirot said softly, almost to himself. "I do not imagine they were paying attention to anyone at all. That, monsieur, is rather the trouble." He rose, smoothing his waistcoat, and walked to the small window that looked out over the darkened terrace, thinking not of Gerald Ashcombe's shaking hands, nor of his oddly convenient absence from every eye in the room, but of the 11 minutes between a woman's greatest triumph and her death, and of how very carefully, how very precisely, someone had chosen to use the one sound in that glittering room loud enough to hide a murder, the sound of 300 people applauding a woman for her courage, never guessing it would be the last sound she ever heard. The names she never said. By midnight, the drawing room of Grosvenor Hall had taken on the peculiar atmosphere of a theatre, after the curtain has fallen and the actors have not yet been told they may leave. Guests sat in small, unhappy clusters, on gilt chairs, never designed for waiting, murmuring to one another in the particular hush people reserve for tragedy that has not yet fully become real to them. Poirot, with Inspector Reeves' rather grudging permission, had been given use of Sir Reginald's small study to conduct interviews, and it was there, in a room lined with hunting prints and the smell of pipe tobacco, that he began to draw out the threads of Vivian Ashcombe's life. The first thread was Bertram Voss. He came in mopping his florid face with a handkerchief already too damp to be of much use, and lowered himself into the chair opposite Poirot with the particular heaviness of a man who has been drinking steadily since the discovery of the body and has not yet decided whether he is drunk enough. "Terrible business," Voss said. "Terrible. Poor Vivian. You knew Madame Ashcombe well." "Knew her," Voss hesitated. "Socially, one does, in these circles. She spoke to you tonight, before her speech. I observed it myself." Voss's handkerchief paused, briefly, in its work. "Did she?" "I don't recall." "You do not recall a conversation from perhaps 2 hours ago?" Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Monsieur, forgive me, but you do not strike me as a man so deeply in his cups tonight, prior to this tragedy, that his memory should already have failed him." There was a silence. Then Voss said low, "She told me I'd made her list. Said it with that damned smile of hers, like she was doing me a kindness by warning me. My housing scheme, you'll have read about it, I dare say. Everyone has. There were transfers, some money that didn't go quite where it should have. I'm not proud of it, but I didn't kill her for it, if that's what you're circling toward. Where were you standing, monsieur, during the applause? Where I'd been all evening, near the west wall, by the Rembrandt print. Ask anyone." "I intend to," Poirot said pleasantly, and made a small note. The second thread was Eleanor Voss, Bertram's wife, a thin, watchful woman who sat with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had whitened, and who answered every question with the careful economy of someone auditing her own words before she spoke them. "My husband didn't kill anyone, Mr. Poirot." "I have not suggested he did, madame. I have suggested only that Madame Ashcombe possessed information that might have ruined him. That is a fact, not an accusation." "Then let me offer you another fact." Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. "Vivian Ashcombe collected people's worst moments the way other women collect jewelry. She wasn't exposing corruption tonight, Mr. Poirot, whatever fine words she used. She was performing. She'd been performing that particular cruelty for years, and half this room had reason to want her silenced. My husband is only one name on a very long list. A list, madame, which you seem to know a great deal about." Eleanor's composure did not crack, but something in her eyes went very still. Everyone in this room knows a great deal about it. That was rather the point of tonight, wasn't it? The third thread, and the one Poirot found himself lingering over longest, was a young man named Julian Price, a journalist, sharp-eyed and thin as a whip, who worked, as it transpired, for a rival society paper and had spent the better part of 2 years locked in a quiet, bitter professional war with the dead woman. "I won't pretend I liked her," Price said, before Poirot had asked. "Save us both the trouble. Vivian Ashcombe ran me out of 2 jobs with stories that weren't entirely true and enjoyed doing it. I came tonight because Sir Reginald's paper, my paper, was covering the gala. Nothing more sinister than that." "And yet," Poirot said, "you were observed near the bar during her speech. Quite close, I am told, to where the champagne was being poured." Price's jaw tightened. "I was getting a drink. It's a charity gala, Mr. Poirot, not a courtroom. Half the room was near that bar at some point tonight." "Indeed, which is rather the difficulty, is it not? Half the room was near the bar. Half the room was standing during the applause. Half the room, I begin to suspect, had reason enough to wish Madame Ashcombe silent, and not one half of them can account for the particular 10 seconds in which a poisoned glass found its way into her hand." Price said nothing to that, and after a moment, Poirot let him go. It was past 1 in the morning by the time the last of the guests had given their statements and been permitted, with evident relief, to leave, and Poirot sat alone in Sir Reginald's study, with his notes spread before him and a cup of tisane gone cold at his elbow, feeling, for the first time that evening, the full weight of his 60-odd years settling into his shoulders. Japp found him there, looking, as he put it, like a man who's misplaced his spectacles and can't quite admit it. "I have not misplaced my spectacles, mon ami," Poirot said, a touch testily. "I have misplaced something rather more troubling, the moment itself. Everyone I have spoken to tonight had a motive. Voss, for his housing scheme. Eleanor Voss, in defense of her husband. Price, for professional humiliation. The husband, for reasons he has not yet fully explained. And yet not one of them can be placed, with any certainty, at Vivian Ashcombe's side, in the moment the glass changed hands." "Because nobody was watching anybody's hands," Japp said. "They were watching her." "Yes." Poirot rubbed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, something in his face looked genuinely tired. An old man in a rented study, at 1 in the morning, further from an answer than he had been 3 hours earlier. "That, Japp, is precisely the trouble. Our murderer did not need to hide in shadow. He needed only to stand in the light at the one moment when 300 pairs of eyes had, by design, turned entirely elsewhere." He gathered his notes, slowly, and rose. "Tomorrow," he said, "I think I must speak with the waiter. The man who poured the wine." The Marchbanks catering staff had been supplied, for the evening, by a firm called Whitfield & Sons, and it was to their offices, in a narrow street behind Piccadilly, that Poirot made his way the following morning, his knees protesting the taxi's abrupt stops with an eloquence he had learned, over the years, simply to ignore. Mr. Whitfield himself, a stooped man with ink-stained fingers, produced a list of the 11 staff who had worked the gala, and it took Poirot the better part of an hour and 3 cups of indifferent tea to work his way through them. Most had little to offer. They had been circulating, trays in hand, weaving through a crowd too absorbed in its own drama to notice the young men and women serving it. One girl remembered, vaguely, refilling glasses near the terrace. A boy of perhaps 19 recalled, with visible excitement at his own small proximity to tragedy, that he had been right by the stage, practically, when the speech ended, though he could offer nothing more useful than that the noise had been something terrible. It was the 10th interview with a dark-haired young man named Thomas Riley that gave Poirot his first real thread to pull. "I did serve her," Riley said, twisting his cap in his hands. "The lady, Mrs. Ashcombe, right at the end there, when everyone stood up clapping. I remember because she looked right at me and said thank you, which the toffs don't usually bother to do, if you'll pardon my saying." "You are certain it was you who handed her the glass?" "Certain as I can be, sir. Though," Riley hesitated. "Though, well, it's only, I'd already got rid of most of my tray by then, see? I only had the 2 or 3 glasses left, and I remember thinking I'd have to go back for more. And then someone, one of the other lads, I think, passed me a fresh glass right as I was heading toward her. Said something like, 'Here, take this one, mine's spoken for,' or some such. I didn't think twice about it." "You don't, do you, in that sort of crush?" Poirot went very still. "Which lad?" "Couldn't say, sir. Honestly, it was that loud, and everyone jammed up together like sardines. Dark coat, same as the rest of us. I didn't get a proper look at his face. Didn't think there was any reason to." "Did you know all the other waiters that evening? By sight, I mean, if not by name," Riley frowned, working through the question with the slow care of a man who has just realized, belatedly, that his answer might matter a great deal. "Mostly, sir. Whitfield's a small outfit. We all know each other from other jobs. But there were a couple of new faces that night, Sir Reginald's own house staff helping out, and I think 1 or 2 hired special for the evening on account of the numbers. And this man who handed you the glass, was he one of these unfamiliar faces?" "Aye." Riley's brow furrowed further, and then, slowly, his face changed. The particular dawning look of a man, realizing he has walked past something important without seeing it. "I couldn't tell you, sir. I didn't look at his face at all. Isn't that a rum thing to say? I must have looked at 100 faces that night, and I couldn't tell you one from another." "It was," Poirot reflected as he left Whitfield and Sons and stood for a moment in the cold grey street, precisely the answer he had expected, and precisely the answer that troubled him most. A murderer who did not need to hide his face, because he had correctly calculated that no one, in that particular crush of noise and movement, would think to remember it. He spent the remainder of the afternoon with the small orchestra that had played the Gala, amiable, tired musicians who remembered a great deal about the acoustics of the hall and nothing whatsoever about the crowd beyond it. For, as the bandleader observed with the weary practicality of his trade, "You don't watch the room, sir. You watch the conductor. Man could hand her a bouquet of poison ivy, and I'd not have seen it over my music stand. And it was there, in fact, in a small, careless oversight that Poirot would not fully appreciate until several days later, that he made his first real misstep. For the bandleader mentioned, almost in passing, that a photographer from the Tatler had been moving through the crowd all evening, capturing the Gala for the following week's society pages, and that this photographer had been standing, if he recalled correctly, somewhere near the terrace doors, getting his shots of the big speech. Poirot noted it, and then, tired, his mind already turning toward the question of the unfamiliar waiter, allowed it to slip toward the bottom of his list of threads to pursue. A photographer, after all, was a photographer. His business was watching, not serving drinks, and Poirot's instinct, honed over 40 years, told him the answer lay with the man who had handed Thomas Riley that fatal glass. It was an entirely reasonable conclusion. It was also, as he would later admit to Japp with a rare and rather sour humility, wrong, or at least not wrong so much as incomplete, for it would be 3 more days, and 1 further death narrowly avoided, before Poirot thought again of the man with the camera standing quietly by the terrace doors, watching everything, and recorded, on however many rolls of film, a moment no one else in that glittering room had thought to look at twice. "You are getting old, Hercule," he murmured to himself in the taxi home, not without a certain rueful affection for his own failing, and rubbed at his tired eyes. "Old, and perhaps a little too pleased with your own cleverness. That is how a man misses what is standing directly in front of him." What the Ledgers knew. Gerald Ashcombe's townhouse in Belgravia was the sort of address that spoke of money inherited rather than earned, and Poirot, admitted by a housemaid with reddened eyes, grief, it seemed, was not confined to the family alone, found the widower in his study, surrounded by the particular chaos of a man attempting to impose order on grief by imposing order on paperwork. "My wife's solicitor sent these over this morning," Ashcombe said, gesturing at the ledgers spread across his desk without looking up. "Her financial affairs. I thought I ought to, I don't know, understand what she'd left behind, before the lawyers descend and turn it all into figures on a page." "May I?" Poirot asked, and without waiting for an answer, drew a chair to the desk and began, with the particular delicate care of a man handling something that might yet bite him, to turn the pages of Vivian Ashcombe's private accounts. They told an interesting story, those ledgers, more interesting perhaps than Gerald Ashcombe himself yet understood, for buried among the accounts of dressmakers and charitable donations were a series of payments made quarterly over the past 18 months to an account held not by any tradesman or society name, but by a solicitor's firm in Holborn that Poirot did not recognize. "Monsieur," Poirot said carefully, "do you know the firm of Grant & Whitlow?" Ashcombe frowned. "No. Should I? Your wife paid them a considerable sum, 4 times a year, for the better part of 2 years. Poirot turned the ledger so Ashcombe could see the figures himself. "That is not the behavior of a woman settling her dressmaker's bill, monsieur. That is the behavior of a woman paying for something she does not wish discussed." Ashcombe stared at the numbers for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that Poirot recognized at once. Not surprise, precisely, but the particular grim confirmation of a suspicion long carried and never voiced. "There was someone," Ashcombe said finally, quietly, "before me. Vivian never spoke of it directly, but I'd heard things. The sort of things one hears, in our circles, whispered behind fans at dinner parties. A man, some scandal, years ago, before we married, that she'd worked very hard to bury. Do you have a name? No, she'd never say. I asked her once, early in our marriage, and she looked at me in a way I'd never seen before. Frightened, I want to say, though Vivian was never frightened of anything, and told me it was buried, and that I ought to leave it that way for both our sakes. I did." He laughed, short and bitter. "God help me, I did." It was a lead worth following, and it led Poirot, 2 days later, to the offices of Grant & Whitlow, where a young clerk, after a great deal of hedging about client confidentiality, and a rather pointed reminder from Poirot that his client was now deceased and rather beyond caring, produced a file that named, at last, the man Vivian Ashcombe had spent 2 years and a considerable fortune keeping quiet. His name was Edmund Travers, and the story, once Poirot had drawn it fully from the reluctant solicitor, was an old and unhappy one. A love affair, some 15 years past, when Vivian had been a young woman new to London and considerably less armoured than the woman she had since become. A child had resulted, a fact known, so far as the solicitor could determine, to no one but Vivian, Travers, and now Poirot himself, given up quietly, at birth, to a family in Sussex, the arrangement handled with the particular ruthless efficiency of the desperate. Travers, it transpired, had resurfaced 18 months ago, fallen on hard times, his own fortune squandered on bad investments and worse company, and had begun, gently at first, and then with increasing insistence, to suggest that Vivian's secret might prove costly to keep buried, should certain newspapers learn of it. The quarterly payments to Grant & Whitlow had been, in effect, the price of his silence, laundered through the solicitor to keep Vivian's own hands clean of the transaction. "A blackmailer," Poirot said to Japp that evening, over a dinner neither of them had much appetite for, "who has, by his own admission to the solicitor, been paid handsomely and regularly for 18 months. Why then would he kill the woman who was paying him? It is rather like murdering the goose for the crime of laying golden eggs, non? Unless she'd stopped paying," Japp said. "Precisely my thought." Poirot set down his fork. "I have asked the solicitor to check. If the payment ceased recently, if Madame Ashcombe had grown tired of Monsieur Traverse's demands, or had simply run out of patience with him, then our blackmailer's golden goose was perhaps no longer laying, and a man with nothing left to lose is a dangerous sort of man indeed." The answer came the following morning, and it was, as answers so often are in matters of this kind, both illuminating and maddeningly incomplete. The payments to Grant and Whitlow had indeed ceased. The final quarterly sum had been due some 6 weeks before the gala, and had never been paid. Vivian Ashcombe, it seemed, had at last decided to stop paying for a sin 15 years old, and had done so, moreover, at almost precisely the same moment she had begun assembling the material for the speech that would, 3 months later, cost her her life. Edmund Travers, when Poirot finally tracked him to a shabby set of rooms above a tobacconist's in Camden, proved to be a thin, grey-faced man of perhaps 50, whose hands shook, from drink, Poirot judged, rather than nerves, and who did not trouble to deny the blackmail when Poirot laid it plainly before him. "She stopped paying," Travers admitted, with the flat honesty of a man too far gone in his own misfortune to bother with pretense. "Told me she was done being frightened of her own past. Told me I could print the story myself, for all she cared, and see how much anyone believed a broken drunk over Vivian Ashcombe." His mouth twisted. "She was right, of course. Nobody would have believed me. That was rather the cruelty of it. Where were you on the night of the gala, monsieur?" "Here, where I always am." Travers gestured, without much energy, at the small, mean room around him. "I wasn't invited to charity galas, Mr. Poirot, whatever else I once was to Vivian Ashcombe. You may ask my landlady if you don't believe me. She'll tell you I was 3 sheets to the wind by 9 o'clock, same as every night." It was, Poirot suspected even as he wrote it down, very likely true. The landlady confirmed it within the hour, with the weary certainty of a woman who had grown accustomed to accounting for her tenants' evenings. And yet the shape of the thing troubled him all the same as he made his way back toward Belgravia in the fading afternoon light. For here was a man with motive and no opportunity, laid against a room full of people with opportunity and, so far, no motive quite sharp enough to explain a poisoning so precisely, so coldly engineered. Somewhere between the two, Poirot was increasingly certain, lay the truth of the matter, and he found himself thinking again, almost without meaning to, of a photographer standing quietly by the terrace doors, watching a room no one else had thought to watch, and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly had been captured on his film. A door that closes. It was Julian Price who occupied the better part of Poirot's attention over the following 2 days, and it was Julian Price who would, by the end of them, teach Poirot a lesson he ought, by his own admission, to have already known, that the sharpest suspicion is not always the truest one. The young journalist's alibi, that he had been near the bar fetching a drink, at the moment of the applause, had struck Poirot from the first as conveniently vague, and a quiet inquiry into Price's recent finances had uncovered something further to sharpen the suspicion. A payment of some £200 into his account, 3 weeks before the gala, from a source the bank's records did not make clear. £200, monsieur, Poirot said, when he called on Price a second time, in the cramped offices of the Bystander where the young man worked, is a considerable sum for a journalist who has, by his own account, spent 2 years locked in professional war with the woman now dead. Perhaps you would care to explain its origin, before I am obliged to ask my friends at Scotland Yard to do so on my behalf. Price's face had gone tight, and for a moment, Poirot believed, was nearly certain in fact, that he had found his thread at last. "It's not what you think," Price said. Enlighten me, then, as to what I ought to think instead. The truth, when it came, arrived with the particular reluctant shame of a man confessing not to murder, but to something smaller and, in its way, more embarrassing. Price had sold Vivian Ashcombe information, not against her, but for her. A tip, gathered through his own sources at a rival paper, regarding one of the men she intended to name in her speech. He had sold it to her 3 weeks before the gala for £200, hating himself for it, hating her more for the ease with which she'd paid, and had said nothing of the arrangement afterward, because it would have ruined what remained of his professional reputation to admit he'd fed information to the very woman he claimed publicly to despise. "You may check with her solicitor if you don't believe me," Price said miserably. "There'll be a record of the payment somewhere, on her side of it. I didn't kill her, Mr. Poirot. I sold her a rumor about Bertram Voss's shipping contracts, and I've been ashamed of it ever since. And now she's dead, and I can't even unshame myself by telling anyone the money didn't come from somewhere worse." It checked out. Grant and Whitlow consulted a third time with visibly diminishing patience for Poirot's inquiries, confirmed a payment of £200 from Vivian Ashcombe's account to Julian Price 3 weeks before her death, precisely as described, and Poirot found himself, late that evening, sitting in his hotel room with his notes spread before him and the uncomfortable sensation of a man who has spent 3 days pursuing a door that, upon finally being opened, reveals only an empty room. "I do not like this case, Jap," he admitted, when his old friend called round with a bottle of indifferent brandy and the sort of sympathetic patience he reserved for Poirot's rarer failures. "I do not like it because I have chased 3 threads now: Voss, Traverse, Price, and each has led me to a man with reason enough to wish her ill, and not one of them with the means to have stood at her side in that particular moment, glass in hand, unseen by 300 witnesses." "Maybe there isn't a 4th thread," Jap said, not unkindly. "Maybe it was one of the 3, and you just haven't found the seam yet." Perhaps. Poirot did not sound convinced, even to his own ear. He rubbed at his eyes, an old man's gesture, and he knew it, and permitted himself, in the privacy of his own hotel room, the small indignity of admitting it. "Or perhaps, mon ami, I have made the oldest error a detective can make. I have gone looking for the person with the strongest motive, when I ought, from the very beginning, to have gone looking for the person with the clearest opportunity, and asked only afterward what reason they might have had." He thought, as he said it, of Thomas Riley's words in the Whitfield offices, a lad in a dark coat, unremarkable, unremembered, pressing a glass into a waiter's hand with 4 words and a stranger's face, and of the photographer by the terrace doors, who had stood through the whole glittering chaos of that applause, with a camera raised, watching, recording, seeing perhaps everything that 300 distracted guests had not. "Jap," he said slowly, sitting up a little straighter, the tiredness in his face giving way, for the first time in 2 days, to something sharper. "The Tatler. Did anyone think to ask them for their photographer's film from that evening?" Jap frowned. "Don't believe so. Why would we? Chap was there to take pictures of the gowns and the jewelry, not the murder." "Yes," Poirot said softly, half to himself, feeling the particular cold clarity that came, always, a little too late in every case he had ever solved. The sense of a door he ought to have opened days ago, standing quietly ajar the entire time. "That, Jap, is precisely what I believed as well, and it is, I think, the reason I very nearly failed to find our murderer at all." What the camera saw. The offices of the Tatler occupied the 3rd floor of a building near Fleet Street, and it was there, the following morning, that Poirot tracked down the photographer who had worked the Marchbanks Gala, a soft-spoken young man named Nigel Ash, who blinked at Poirot through thick spectacles and seemed faintly astonished that anyone should take an interest in his work, beyond the usual captions for the society pages. "The Gala? Yes, of course. I've the prints somewhere. Well, most of them. Editor pulled the ones he wanted for next week's issue, but the rest are still in the darkroom files. Didn't think anyone would want the discards. I should like to see all of them, monsieur. Every frame, not merely the ones your editor found flattering. It took the better part of 2 hours, hunched over a light table in a cramped darkroom that smelled of chemical and old cigarette smoke, before Poirot found what he had, without quite admitting it to himself, been hoping to find. Frame after frame showed the expected things: gowns, jewelry, the practiced smiles of society's better photographed faces, until, near the end of the roll taken during Vivian Ashcombe's speech, a sequence of 3 frames captured the room at the precise moment the applause began. The first frame showed Vivian at the podium, radiant mid-bow. The second, taken perhaps 4 seconds later, showed the crowd rising, a blur of movement and raised hands. And the third, grainy, imperfect, the photographer's attention clearly more fixed on Vivian herself than on the crowd around her, showed, at the very edge of the frame, almost cropped away entirely, a waiter in a dark coat passing something to another waiter near the terrace doors. Poirot bent close, his breath fogging faintly against the cold light table, and felt something settle into place with the particular quiet certainty that came only rarely, and only ever at the end of a case rather than the middle of one. Monsieur Ash, this man here, do you have any other frames that show him more clearly? Earlier in the evening, perhaps, before the speech? Ash sorted through the remaining prints with growing interest of his own, and after some minutes produced a single frame, taken nearly an hour before the murder, that showed the same dark-coated figure standing near the bar. His face, this time, caught almost fully in profile, unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of face that vanishes instantly from memory, precisely because it offers nothing for memory to hold on to. But Poirot had seen that face before, not at the gala, he was certain of that, but somewhere, in some other context, filed away in the vast, orderly archive of his own memory, waiting to be retrieved. It took him the better part of the taxi ride back to his hotel to place it, and when he did, he sat very still for a long moment, feeling the particular vertigo of a man who has just watched an entire case rearrange itself around a single overlooked fact. The face belonged to a young man named Peter Voss. Bertram Voss's nephew, not his son, for Voss had none, but the son of his late brother, raised, so far as Poirot's subsequent inquiries revealed, largely on his uncle's charity, after his own father's business had failed, and his own father, shortly after, had taken his own life, unable to bear the shame of it. Peter Voss worked, as it happened, as a junior clerk in his uncle's firm, the same firm whose housing scheme Vivian Ashcombe had intended to expose that evening, the same scheme that, should it collapse under public scrutiny, would take with it not merely Bertram Voss's fortune, but very possibly his freedom, and with both, the only stability Peter Voss had known since his father's death. He was hired for the evening, Mr. Whitfield confirmed, consulted a second time, with considerably more attention paid to his own records than he had troubled to give the first occasion. Ah, yes, here, special addition to the staff list, brought on at the request of Sir Reginald himself, apparently at the recommendation of one of the trustees. I hadn't thought to check the name against anyone connected to the guests. Why would I? It's not the sort of thing one thinks to check. No, Poirot reflected, sitting alone once more that evening with his notes finally, for the first time in 6 days, beginning to form a single coherent shape. It was not the sort of thing anyone thought to check, and that, precisely, was the terrible elegance of what Peter Voss had done. He had not hidden in shadow, nor slipped in through some servant's entrance under cover of darkness. He had walked in through the front door, in borrowed livery, arranged, so Poirot now strongly suspected, through his uncle's connection to Sir Reginald's trust, and had stood in plain sight all evening, one face among 11 identically dressed young men, waiting only for the one moment loud enough, chaotic enough, watched and yet unwatched enough, to do what needed doing. He thought of Riley's words again. Here, take this one, mine's spoken for, and understood them now not as the idle courtesy of one waiter to another, but as the final, precise motion of a young man who had spent the whole evening waiting for exactly one burst of applause, and who had walked out of Grosvenor Hall afterward, Poirot did not doubt, entirely unremembered by every one of the 300 guests he had moved among. "I very nearly missed him," Poirot murmured to the empty room, and there was no triumph in it, only the tired honesty of a man old enough to know that cleverness, unchecked by diligence, is worth nothing at all. I looked for the man who hated her enough to kill her, and I forgot to look for the boy who loved someone enough to kill for him instead. The little grey cells, and what they missed. Sir Reginald offered his drawing room a final time, with rather less enthusiasm than he had offered it for the gala itself, and it was there, on a grey Thursday afternoon, that Poirot gathered them. Gerald Ashcombe, pale and composed now in the particular way of grief that has exhausted itself into stillness. Bertram and Eleanor Voss, sitting a careful distance apart. Julian Price, notebook absent for once, hands folded, and, standing near the door as though he had not quite decided whether he meant to stay, Peter Voss, 23 years old, with his uncle's heavy build not yet grown into, and a face that had, Poirot thought, the particular unfinished quality of a young man who has done something irreversible and has not yet fully understood that he cannot undo it. Inspector Reeves stood near the window, arms folded, watching Poirot with the wary attention of a man who has learned, over the course of one difficult week, not to interrupt. "I will not keep you long," Poirot began. "I am an old man, and this has been a tiring case. Tiring in the way that teaches humility, which is not always a comfortable lesson, though I have found it, over 40 years, to be a necessary one." He walked, slowly, to the center of the room. "When I began, I asked myself the question every detective asks, who wished Vivian Ashcombe dead? And I found, to my considerable frustration, that the answer was very nearly everyone. Monsieur Voss, whose fortune she threatened to expose, Madame Voss, in defense of her husband, Monsieur Price, humiliated by her professionally for 2 years, Monsieur Traverse, blackmailed and then abandoned by her. Even you, monsieur," a small nod toward Gerald Ashcombe, who argued with her only hours before her death, and who could not account for his own whereabouts during the very moment she died. "I told you," Ashcombe said quietly. "I was near the bar." "You were, monsieur. I have since confirmed it. 3 separate guests recall you there, though none thought to mention it until asked directly. For the same reason, no one remembered anything clearly that night. They were watching Vivian, not you, not each other, not the 11 young men in dark coats moving quietly among them with trays of champagne." He let that sit a moment. "That was my error. You understand? I spent 6 days asking who hated her enough. I ought to have asked, from the very first evening, a simpler question. Who could have stood beside her, unseen, in the one moment loud enough to hide a murder? Not who had reason, who had opportunity, and opportunity, I have come to believe, is very often the quieter and more honest question." Bertram Voss had gone very still in his chair. "The gala employed 11 waiters that evening," Poirot continued. 10 from the catering firm of Whitfield and Sons, known to one another, familiar faces in that world, and 1, brought on specially, at the recommendation of a trustee, wearing the same dark livery as the rest, indistinguishable to 300 distracted eyes. He turned, at last, toward the young man by the door. "Monsieur Peter Voss, I believe?" The room went very quiet. Eleanor Voss's hand found her husband's arm. "I did not kill her," Bertram Voss said hoarsely. "I swear to you." "No, monsieur, you did not. I do not believe you knew anything of what your nephew intended, and I believe, moreover, that had you known, you would have stopped him, whatever it cost you." Poirot's voice was gentle now, in the way it became only at the end of a case, when cleverness had done its work, and only sorrow remained to be managed. "But your nephew, I think, knew rather more than you did. He knew what your ruin would mean. Not merely the loss of your fortune, monsieur, but the loss of the only steady thing in his own life since his father's death. He had watched one man he loved destroyed by scandal and shame already. I do not think he was prepared to watch it happen twice. Peter Voss had not moved from the door, but something in his face had begun, slowly, to come apart. A photograph taken that evening, Poirot went on, shows you near the terrace doors during the applause, passing a glass to another waiter with the words, "I am told, take this one, mine's spoken for." A small deception, a single sentence, spoken in a crowded room, to a man who had no reason to remember your face, on an evening when 11 identically dressed young men moved through 300 guests who were watching only the woman at the podium. You did not need to hide, monsieur. You needed only to be unremarkable, and for one evening, in borrowed livery, arranged, I do not doubt, through your uncle's connection to this house, you made yourself exactly that. Peter Voss's voice cracked, and for a moment, he seemed younger than his 23 years, a boy rather than a man, standing very still, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting, in truth, for this exact moment since the night it happened. I didn't plan to. I want you to understand that. I went that night meaning only to watch, to see if there was some way to talk to her, to ask her not to. He stopped, started again, and then I heard her up there, so pleased with herself, and I thought about my uncle in prison, and my aunt with nothing, and my father. His jaw worked. My father put a gun to his head in his own study, rather than face what a scandal like that does to a family, Mr. Poirot. I watched what it did to us. I wasn't going to watch it happen again. Where did you obtain the poison, monsieur? My uncle's firm does business with a chemical supplier. I'd have known where to find such things, where they were kept, how to take a small amount without it being noticed. I'd thought about it for weeks. Not seriously, I told myself. Just thought about it. And then that night, watching her stand up there enjoying herself, enjoying what she was about to do to my family, it stopped being just thinking. He looked, then, not at Poirot but at his uncle, and something in his young face begged, quite plainly, for an understanding Bertram Voss did not seem able to give. I did it for you, Peter said. I want you to know that. Whatever else happens now, I did it for you. Bertram Voss said nothing at all. He had put his face in his hands, and Eleanor Voss, beside him, had begun, very quietly, to weep. Not for Vivian Ashcombe, Poirot thought, but for the particular grief of a woman watching a family unravel in a room full of strangers, unable to stop any part of it. Inspector Reeves stepped forward then, and the necessary words were said, and Peter Voss was led from the room with the peculiar dignity of a young man who has, in confessing, finally set down a weight he had carried alone for 6 unbearable days. Poirot did not stay long after. He declined Sir Reginald's offer of sherry, made his apologies to Gerald Ashcombe, who shook his hand with the distracted courtesy of a man still absorbing that his wife's death had been, in the end, neither about him nor about any of the enemies he had feared for her, but about a family tragedy entirely separate from her own, and walked out, alone, into the grey London afternoon. Japp caught up with him on the pavement. Well, Japp said, you got there. I got there, Poirot agreed. 6 days later than I ought to have, and only because a photographer happened to capture, quite by accident, a single frame he did not know mattered. He shook his head slowly. I looked for hatred, Japp, when I ought to have looked for love, the desperate, misguided sort that does terrible things in defense of the people it cannot bear to lose. That is not a mistake I am accustomed to making. I do not much care for the taste of it. You still got there, Japp said again, gently, for he had known Poirot long enough to recognize when the old man needed the reminder more than the compliment. Poirot did not answer at once. He stood for a moment on the pavement, an old man in a good coat, his moustache neat as ever, his knees aching faintly in the cold, and thought of Vivian Ashcombe standing at that podium, glowing with the particular light of a woman certain, for one final evening, that she controlled every eye in the room, never once suspecting that among the 100 faces applauding her courage, one belonged to a boy who had already decided, quietly and irrevocably, that she would not live to enjoy it. The most public moments, he said finally, half to himself, hide the most private griefs, mon ami. That is the lesson of this case, I think, and not a comfortable one. We none of us watch each other so closely as we believe. We watch only the person standing in the light. And it is always, always, the one standing quietly in the crowd who might be carrying the heaviest thing of all. He turned up his collar against the wind, and together, in the way of two old friends who had walked away from 100 such rooms before, they went to find something warm to eat.